Welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. This week's episode is a chat about how our leadership approaches have changed over the decades and what we wish we'd known when we were starting out. We're joined by Steve White, Chairman of Motorhomes Limited, Board Member for Orwell Housing Association and Deputy Chair for BLESMA, the Armed Forces charity for Limbless Veterans. And also in another life, Bobby's boss. So come join us in Being Your Own Change.
Hi everybody, Bob and Bridge back again for More Than a Lumpy Jumper, and today we are very excited to invite and welcome Steve White to join us in conversation about life experience basically and how our leadership styles have changed as we have allegedly, and I'm going to say allegedly, grown up, because having just witnessed our conversation just before we press record, it is clear that there is minimal growing up having gone on. Let me attempt to introduce Steve. I'm more interested to hear from Steve about what he wants to say about himself. But how do I know Steve? Steve was my boss. Oh, I'm now trying to do maths again. How many years ago? Probably 2010?
I think, get the abacus out, Bobby. I think it's before that, maybe.
Really?
Yeah, a long while ago.
So Steve joined the company that I was already in, but Steve has had a long career of doing all sorts of things, very much in the operational array before he became a chief exec. There's lots more to say about things that I'm in awe of about Steve in terms of the things that he takes on for charity, etc., etc. But when I think about Steve as a leader for myself, he was the guy who properly stuck a mirror up in my face to take a good long look at some of the things that I wasn't quite so good at or where I could do better. I was in my 30s at the time and really playing the petulant card, which is a word that's come up quite a lot already, and behaved really appallingly in front of the governance structure most off, where I got pretty sulky because I didn't get my own way. And Steve just had a brilliant way of pulling me up on it and making me do better and wanting to do better. And I think we've been talking about leadership qualities, and working for somebody where you actually really want to do well, where you don't want to let them down, was key, and not something that I'd really witnessed that much in corporate life until I met this man. And that's why I've invited you to have to put up with the two of us in this conversation today, and you are warmly welcomed by me. And I know you've only just met Bridge. You were rude to her within 5 minutes, which is excellent. The only other thing to say is when I asked Steve...
He did give us the name for a new podcast.
He did, yes. And the other thing that, just before we hand over and start asking Steve some questions, was that when I asked him what he wanted me to say about him, he said, once a twat, always a twat. But I think that is also why we've invited him, because he's nicely irreverent and works very well with the two of us.
Well, good morning, and thanks for inviting me on Carbs and Fat.
That's not cool.
Delighted to be with you, or whatever it was that we agreed that we're not to call our conversation. But no, it's good to have a chat.
So, Steve, we've been talking about allies in the way that Bobby has described your influence or your impact on her as a leader. I just wondered whether you considered yourself to be a gender ally, whether that's something that either you've considered yourself to be or you've deliberately attempted to be.
Yeah, so I haven't had a few minutes to think about this.
You're referring to our technical issues and the fact that
rock on roll signals
are like Laurel and Hardy of the podcasting world.
Yes, I've had 12 hours to reflect on the question.
Rude.
I think my initial thoughts is also the thoughts that I'm still hanging on to, which is that I don't think I ever really thought about gender in the way that you've described it. The word ally, I think, is an interesting one. Working with people's always been important for me, and remains so today. So whoever I work with and have the pleasure to work with a few exceptions, including one or two people that might be on this podcast, but whoever I've had the opportunity and pleasure to work with over the years, I see them as human beings, and I tend not to see them as specific or people with legs and arms missing, or so they're just human beings. And I guess my values as an individual, not necessarily in a leadership context, is that I've always tried to treat naturally people as human beings and equal. And that's absolutely the case with at the time I worked with Bobby and indeed since.
Thanks, Steve. It's interesting and refreshing, I guess, to come across people who really are just trying to work as best they can with everybody. I think that the reason that we talk about gender allies is because we have come across issues throughout our careers because of our gender, and we have been influenced either by people who have seen the lack of representation of women in places and made a deliberate attempt to help increase that representation and increase the women they are working with, or help the women that they're working with to navigate some of the discriminatory practices. And there have been others who have just been discriminatory and have blocked as hard as they can for us to move into particular roles because of the fact that we possess lovely jumpers.
I've seen a bit of that, and it's outrageous. But not necessarily just discriminatory towards women, men discriminating towards women. I've seen people that are discriminating people of colour, from social backgrounds. In fact, I had some of that experience as a kid myself. Being on the sharp end of that is not great. I get pretty grumpy about those types of behaviours. And if I witness them, then I call them out. And continue to call them out, sometimes to my detriment. And that's included senior politicians once or twice in the recent past, which has been a hoot. But I do believe that everybody that walks this earth, and in my case hops this earth, as I've only got one leg, is equal, and they deserve to be treated with respect. So coming back to the essence of your question, and particularly around gender, all I can say to you is that if I've had the opportunity to encourage women to push through perceived or real glass ceilings, then I would have done what I can to make that happen. I tend, I think, more to do something about the glass ceiling than actually individuals. I would rather attack the impediment that's preventing individuals being able to achieve their full potential. But I will also help individuals in isolation to be the best that they can be. Sometimes that's worked, and other times less so. But I think that's probably the best insight in terms of how I would like to work and how I tend to work that I can offer you.
Thanks, Steve. And you're a man after my own heart in that respect, in terms of, obviously, although we do talk about gender mainly because Bobby and I are women, but the sort of focus of our discussion is that removing these types of barriers actually benefits everywhere. It increases diversity across the board. And my particular bugbear is, in fact, culture changes that are necessary to be made to increase diversity more generally that benefit everyone. They benefit people of colour, they benefit people who identify by different genders, neurodiverse people, gender diverse people, and also cis men as well, because Bobby sent me something this morning, the use of the word twat, which you identify along with as well, I understand.
I'm very familiar with the term.
And just interested in the fact that although it refers to female genitalia, it actually is often used in respect of men. I think there are a couple of other words as well that maybe
we are not using that on this podcast.
Okay, all right then, we won't use that word. But my sister used to have a tiara with that word on in diamonds that she used to, not real diamonds, but that she used to wear when she was out clubbing because she said she wanted to reclaim the word. But anyway,
my kind of girl.
I digress. I don't think she uses the word now. She's got 2 kids, and occasionally when I've used it, she's said, "But you used to have a shush." She referred to Caitlin Moran, who was on Radio 2, talking about the importance of including and inviting everyone into allyship, and that you can't brighten your light by dimming someone else. I love Caitlin Moran. Caitlin, if you're out there, I am ever so slightly.
You have to share her.
But
I just have to say.
Oh, all right then. I'll share her. I know lots and lots of women have girl crushes on Caitlin Moran. But anyway, she just said that men are the other half of feminism. If we want the world to be good for women, we have to also make it good for men. And I think that that's been some of the messaging that we've been discussing in the last couple of podcasts, which obviously I'm sure you will be listening to, Steve. I find it really interesting that when I was younger and I was learning and growing and outraged by lots of things that were impeding me, or being told that I couldn't do things because I was a girl. Or a woman, as I corrected Bobby yesterday. I didn't really think about men in the equation. While I've been really lucky to have some really, really strong male allies, particularly as I moved into bomb disposal, it allowed me to train in those roles and then support me while I was doing those roles. I think that as I've got older, I've become very, very much more aware of this other side of the equation, as well as the impact of that it's not just about feminism, it's not just about increasing gender representation, it's much more about just increasing diversity and making sure, as you say, that everybody has freedoms, everyone has rights, everyone has equality, everyone has equal access to opportunities. But being a woman, obviously I focus on that, but I don't see that any work that I do to change cultures for the benefit of female representation. I'm very aware that in reality what I would be doing is increasing representation or freedom for everybody, because diversity, we win when there's diversity. I really struggle to understand how we don't.
Yeah, I agree. And as leaders, and this is the context in which I tend not to describe myself with those types of labels, but as leaders, and I guess we all have leadership roles in the past and currently, our job is really, more than anything else, is to create the environment for people to shine.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really change whether you're man, woman, black, white, disabled, abled. Our job is to help individuals who we have some degree of responsibility for in a leadership context, to let them kick the doors down, smash the glass ceilings, whichever metaphor you want to use, so that they shine. And those idiot dinosaurs that still hold to around gender or any discriminatory views, they find themselves in a tight spot because they can't ignore the bright light that's dazzling them. And that, for me, is really more than anything else, that what we can do as individuals is make life difficult for the numpties that don't see the potential, that's sitting opposite the table or opposite the factory floor or working alongside them. And I've seen many cases of that where people have held to views which are stereotypical, but then an individual has done something which makes it very difficult for that individual to hold to that view. It's a hoot. It's great because it forces people to reconsider stereotypes. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, and I think that is entirely what I witnessed when we were working together. I remember distinctly you sending me or encouraging me to go and do a course on positive power and influence, and which actually created, I was referring to it as my porridge moment, which comes from David Baldwin, who, of course, we both work with as well, where he said his came when this bowl of porridge exploded in a microwave and he thought his whole world had come to an end. He went off and did something else. And away on that course, learning to appreciate that positive power and influence is for self, but it has to be for everybody else as well. And we ended up doing this exercise where we got to, it was horrible. For me, it must have been what people experience in the stock exchange, the whole buy, sell.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that I've been saying to Bridget, and this will have been your experience of me as well, that I often used to rant and say a lot and say very little when I was in a particular mood. But at that point, I got utterly drowned out. I couldn't find my voice at all because I was probably one of two women in the room, and I literally crashed and burned. I left the room and I was just a pulpy mess, and I didn't even know whether I would be able to go back in again or not because it had given such a reaction to it. And yet the rebuilding after that, for when I got back, and I know we didn't work very long together after that course, but it put me on the right path. But that's what I'd witnessed you doing all the time, your positive power and influence. But you created an environment that collectively brought all of us in. And we've been talking about what that feels like when it's a collective as well.
That's very generous of you. I mean, we all learn, and you and I and Bridge are still learning today. I think your issues at the time was more about self-confidence, actually. And you always had the skill sets to allow people, to go back to my early description, to shine, but you were bloody good at masking them. For you, it was for you to feel confident enough to tell people that actually I do know what I'm talking about, and it wasn't that difficult with you. But the thing is that for me as an individual, forget about these labels and leaders and things, for me as an individual, I get more out of life if I'm working with people or spending time with people that are comfortable and are enjoying themselves and feel confident and don't feel constrained by any artificial barriers or predicated on these old these old constraints and impediments. So for me, it wasn't just about where you were concerned and when we were working together all of those years ago. Then and now, it's really about, for me, I personally enjoy life better if I can see other people enjoying life and enjoying what they're doing and don't feel uncomfortable and do feel confident enough to be able to say what it is that's going on between their ears without fear or favour or concern that they might be perceived in any particular way. And I think if that happens, I get more out of it, they get more out of it. And obviously in a professional context, there has to be certain rules around conduct and behaviour. But within those broad parameters, allowing people to say and contribute and be who they are without constraints linked to these stereotypes of gender, race or any other dimension, I get more out of them. And they get more out of the people that they're working with and are generally a happier and content people. But you clearly weren't, because you buggered off, as you just said. After you started that journey, you buggered off after about 5 minutes.
Don't send anyone else on the course, for Christ's sake. But I think I'm just sitting here chuckling to myself, and I'm sure that this will get edited out, but I just have to say, because Bridget needs to hear this, you also encouraged me to build stronger relationships with people in the governance structure. So I attempted to and asked somebody if they could help me more around being more strategic, to which the advice I got was put your tits away. Maybe I'm showing too much. Maybe I'm showing too much of that. Not that they're going to see videos, but her concern, bless her, was that I was putting off men around the table at meetings because I was showing too much cleavage. I'm not sure that I was or I wasn't, but I remember coming out.
What do you think?
So I honestly don't know. I do remember the conversation, but I don't know whether she was flashing too much. But I suspect that woman that said that to her.
I'm not, and this is the thing about having to have allies of all descriptions, and that was definitely not allyship. I just remember Steve said, "Oh, how did the conversation go?" I said, "She told me to put my tits away," and he said, "Oh, she mentioned that, did you?" I was like, "What? You knew she was gonna say? You knew she was gonna say it?" I was like, but I clearly don't think that she'd have been happy enough, even if I'd have turned up in a fucking Winceyette nightie. I was never.
But actually, back to the plot. I think that was good experience.
It was.
Roberta. That was good experience, because as much as the world is changing, and hopefully for the better, we are still faced with, more frequently than we would like, numpties. And being able to deal with numpties, perhaps you're better at dealing with numpties now than you was then, but being able to deal with numpties is an important part of our roles as leaders as well. So yeah, I do remember that. Interestingly, I think, well, just going back to you and experience, and I don't know whether this applied to you, but because we come from the military, the military construct is really around, you listen to your more senior officer, commander, and you don't challenge necessarily, and those old-fashioned command and control structures, which are less so these days in the military, but it's still there as a fundamental principle. I did think at the time when I was working with Bowie that some of that deferential that she had to more senior people in the organisation did stem from perhaps her time in the military, but I've digressed slightly.
No, because it's actually interesting because I wanted to ask you, we're talking about growth and changes, and would you say that maybe your approach to work or being a leader has changed as you've grown? Was there a time maybe where you cringe and go, Bobby and I certainly have those, go, oh God, I remember when I used to be like that?
Shed loads. I mean, the cock-ups that I've made over the years, things I've said and done. Do you remember the old Encyclopedia Britannica? I could fill 12 volumes in 8-point text of cock-ups from my life.
Any you want to share?
Business.
Like,
come on, Steve.
I'll end up in an industrial tribunal if I share the most significant ones, I can promise you. But no, I've made thousands and continue to make thousands of cock-ups. One I did quite recently at BLESMA, what a numpty I am. So you Bobby knows I'm an above-knee amputee. I met a new member who lost his arm in Afghan, and I went to shake his bloody hand when I introduced him. And he didn't have a hand, and I'm the vice chair of the charity. What a complete numpty I am. So I do things, silly things, but never maliciously, but silly things that if I look back on, I would like to do differently. What's interesting about today's environment, though, is, and I don't want to be evangelical about it, but there is a sense of being absolute around how you describe people and labels, and the debate around pronouns, and all of that is important to a degree. But I do wonder sometimes whether we lose our ability to interact with people as humans because we are filtering so much about what can I say, what can I not say, for fear of causing offence. And of course, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that we are disrespectful to anybody. I do see examples these days where people are very concerned about how they approach a situation or an individual. And from leadership point of view, I think
I agree. And it's something that we've been discussing as well, but very much around competency-based interview questions and scripting things, and the manager that wants the checklist of how to go and have a conversation with somebody, and all of that is around fear a lot of the time, and worry and anxiety about what retribution will come if they. And we were also talking about this way of
forgiveness.
Is it wrong to be asking questions? But again, I learned this from you. I remember going into an interview with you, with my little competency-based interview pack, because I thought that was the way to do it, and was explaining to you that these are the questions that we were going to ask. And the guy had hardly got his coat off, and you said, "So what the hell have you done applying for this job when you run a pig farm?" And I might as well just open the window and thrown the sheet of questions out. But whilst I was, oh God, what is he doing? The whole thing was what I watched unfold was a proper conversation. And I don't think I used a competency-based interview question or encouraged anyone to use that after that, because I thought we are in real territory with a real human being, having that conversation and asking the question. And I think that you're right with all of the things that we're now meant to do. And Bridge was saying this yesterday about where you can overwoke things, maybe a little bit, that I would much prefer to be in that mode of, I don't know, so I'd like to be able to ask you, and I'm coming from a good place because I want to understand more.
I think that's fundamentally the point I was trying to say at the very beginning, which was, whoever it is that's sitting opposite the table from you is a human being. And if you can engage with that individual, on the basis that you are interested, you are genuinely interested in them, and them as an individual and their life and their experience and their perspectives, then you're much more likely to engage with them and understand who they are than through a very refined, filtered set of structures which take you in a direction which makes it more difficult to get a good feel for who they are and who you are. And from an interview perspective, I don't remember the example, Bob.
I've got lots of stories about you
that I embarrassed you.
It sounds like there were lots of them. So
yeah, I fear that may be right, but I don't remember that. But I can recognise that what I would have been really interested in is understanding that individual and their motivation. And the best way to get to understand that is to ask the obvious question. So if this individual was coming to work for Bobby and I, it was a housing association at the time, and they came from a pig farm, then there is an obvious question. There is about what is it about his or hers background or experience that was particularly relevant for whatever it is that we were talking to at the time. And you wouldn't always get to that through a very structured HR questionnaire based upon competencies. But you might get into those, and I suspect we did get into
we
those,
didn't.
Bobby. Didn't we? Oh, okay. Oh dear. That must have been one of the tribunals then. No, I think it's as I say, it's the fundamental point for me is that I'm really interested in human beings. In whatever shape and form they are, I'm really interested in human beings. And the more I can get to understand them and they get to understand me, and the better that relationship, in whatever context it's struck, the better that relationship.
Do you think ever has it been thus? Or can you think back to what it might have looked like when you were 20, 30, 40, different decade? Has it shifted?
Yeah. I think my learning of myself has shifted. Yeah, and which I suppose is a good thing. But I think the first management or supervisory job I got is after I left the military. I was really lucky to get into a major bank. And there was a guy there that saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. And we've all had the benefit of those types of individuals through our life. Bearing in mind I left school with just one O-level, he was prepared to put me into environments where I was stretched and challenged. And that quickly turned into the first line leadership role in, I can't remember, it was certainly in my late 20s. And at that time, I was sheep dipped in the HR protocols of the time about this is how you go about leading people and this is how you go about managing people. And some of that is fantastic, good advice, basic stuff around record keeping and being clear. And I found that a very restrictive approach to how I interacted with people got me into all sorts of difficulties because people didn't understand what it was that I was trying to say to them, because I was contriving my thoughts to operate and in a way of this is the model that HR says that I had to work with at the time. And it was systematic, very structured. And I think people didn't get to know me. And, we talk about authenticity, don't we, in leadership? So because people didn't get to understand me and I couldn't really convey myself in a way that was what was really going on in my head or in my heart to the people that I was working with, I got myself into all sorts of difficulties. So I think in my 20s, I learned that very early on that I need to let people understand who I am in the way that I operate and the way that I go about my business and how I interact with people. And that was transformative for me. I was able to build much more positive and effective relationships with people after I felt more comfortable to actually be who I am, including, as it will be apparent from what Bobby was saying, I'm not at all formal. Once I didn't wear the badge of I'm your manager or I'm your supervisor or I'm your boss, I never described myself in those ways. But I'm a human being and here's how I operate, and this is what I'm good at, this is what I'm crap at, and this is how I would like to work with you. That was transformative in how my relationships with people work. And I think that was the start of my leadership journey, which really, late 20s, here's the Bible according to HR management, got myself into an absolute mess, became much more focused, learned that actually that stopped me being who I am and building relationships with people that were effective. And that was really the journey which I think I'm still on today.
Cool. Bobby, do you, I mean, we're talking about things that we've learnt or the things that have changed us in terms of our leadership approaches as we've got older. Is there anything, like, you know, there have been times where you see articles where people are like, oh, well, I wish someone had told me when I was 20 if the future me was going to go back. What would I want that message to be? Bobby, aged 50.
She's not that young.
Rude. She is. We both are. So if you could press a time machine and go back and talk to maybe Bobby as she left the army, what do you think you would say?
Oh, excuse me. I'm almost feeling like riffing off a little bit of what Steve was just talking about, because I really did have bizarrely a confidence issue in certain situations, and that was me into my 30s. I was 40 while we were actually working together, I think, as well, if I remember rightly. So it took me a long time to come by who I really was. And so I don't live with regrets. So, you know, all of that happened for a reason. But that inner child bit, we've talked about playfulness and everything else besides. I wish I had been kinder to myself and not given myself such a hard time and not literally metaphorically beaten myself up over and over again of not being good enough when I was actually good enough. But I lived a long time expecting to be found out to not really be warranting the job or the role that I actually had. And
it's interesting
go on.
That you say that. We've got sort of a very similar issue. It's about you talked in another podcast episode about being unashamedly yourself.
Unapologetically
that's
me.
That's one of the things that you've moved into. Steve's example too is talking about acceptance and saying, this is me. I am going to embrace the leader that is me, the person that is me, rather than trying to fit into a box that someone's created that says leader. The transformation, and myself included, was when I decided to just go, I'm going to stop trying to be other people or live up to other things, and I'm just going to be me. And maybe, I think you talked about holding a mirror up, Steve, holding a mirror up to you. Sometimes I try when I'm still feel lacking of self-confidence, etc. But sometimes I try and look at myself the way other people see me, and I know that other people view me as a loyal, tenacious, caring, loving leader. And I use the word loving, not in a creepy, romantic way. But I do think leadership is about love. Steve's talked about just accepting people, wanting to look at people as humans and being kind to yourself and going, I am human too. And I need to give myself a break for not being the perfect leader that you might see in the books like Brené Brown or Simon Sinek, and you've imagined these leaders floating around with angel wings being perfect. You and Steve and myself have all, in reality, what we wish we'd known when we were younger was that we're pretty awesome and we should work how feels naturally rather than try and behave in a particular way that we've been told is the way that we should be.
I think that's really important, Bridge, because there's an old saying that I think I learned in my 20s, hundreds of years ago, which is people buy from people. And I think what that means, and what I took it to mean then, is that people don't have to like you to respect you. Okay. But people, if they do respect you because your values are things that they can understand, and that you are who you are, then that takes you a long way in leadership. That takes you a long way with leadership. If you contrive to behave in a way which is inconsistent with who you really are, people will feel it. That the person on the other side of the table, or the 300 people you're talking to in a conference, delivering a presentation, if you contrive to do something which is fundamentally different for who you are, the senses of human beings pick that up, and your impact and your ability to influence or lead, in the context of this podcast, in my view, is severely diminished. So being who you are in a respectful and professional context that we're talking about here, without all of the humour that we've touched upon, will buy you a significant degree of credibility. And that's really important in leadership, for people to know that the person that they're interacting with, they may not want to spend Christmas with you, but they will certainly respect that they understand that that individual is being honest, is being clear, is being consistent, and consistency in leadership is really important, with the values that they've come to understand that describe that individual. And that was certainly part of Bobby's problem, because she was devoid of confidence, which is bizarre for a woman which is so effervescent and full of life. But it was clear that Bobby was behaving in a way which was inconsistent with who she is innately inside. I think it's really important. And if I was sitting down talking to my 20-year-old self now, I'd certainly be saying, don't be a numpty, just try to be who you really are. And people will be much more inclined to listen to you.
Agree. I think
straight with them.
The statement for my 20-year-old self would be, back yourself. And then in my 30s, it would be, just do it without needing applause. Because that was the other thing that needed to fall away for me, that I would constantly need a pat on the back, when in fact, pat myself on the back for whatever it was that I was actually doing, or don't even pat, just do. And I think that there is for me, the distinction about being unapologetically me versus what you see is what you get. What you see is what you get is the bravado, and my effervescence in the time that I knew Steve was more forced, when in actual fact it really is me. But I was almost using it as a shield to all the worry of not getting things right that was going on behind. And I still like to get things right. I also know that I cock it up a lot of the time as well, and just put your hands up and mea culpa and move on. It's not going to be the end of the world.
And the cock up bits, yeah, and I think the cock up bit's really important actually. The best leaders that I know and that I've come across are people that are not, there are mistakes and there are mistakes, and there are cock ups and there are major cock ups, and there are always consequences for very major cock ups. But generally speaking, the best leaders I know that have made a minor cock up or have done something silly, they're okay with it. They're okay with it. That I've dropped a clanger here, and this is what I've done about it. That's cool. And the leaders that poke people in the eye when that happens, I think, are losing an opportunity to help that individual understand that learning and move on from it, rather than being fearful that they're going to make a cock up and don't make any bloody decisions. So allowing people to create an environment where they're learning through mistakes within reason is a really healthy way of growing leadership capability.
And it's a cycle, isn't it? I think that if you're a leader or someone who's grown up in a culture where your boss gives you grief for every tiny little mistake and you're afraid, then you will, as you grow into a leader, that is what you understand is leadership. And there's a tendency then for that to just recreate itself, that horrible vicious circle. And that leader will then create the same fearful lack of safety, as you say, within reason. Obviously, if people are going to die, then you need to get a grip of it. But I too, when I've worked with the United Nations, certainly many of the culture is, they say, we've got a no blame culture. We absolutely have a blame culture. Everyone is terrified of making mistakes. Everyone's looking over their shoulders. Everyone is waiting for someone else. People are finger pointing. People are covering their backs. There's a real sense of fear in many of the places that I worked. They're already in fear because they're in places that are lacking security, and they're waiting for the next war to erupt or the next disaster to strike. So people are already tense and stressed. So having that added into the mix is just really makes for a very unpleasant working environment.
Yeah, and it paralyses organisations. It paralyses because people are forever covering their arses and worrying about what might happen if they do X or Y. I think if you can liberate people from that and allow individuals within reason, as you say, Bridge, but there are consequences for major mistakes, and as leaders we know that that's a part of the gig. But as a culture, to create an environment where you recognise mistakes are going to happen and that you're not going to rip a strip off somebody for making a mistake, enables people to be open. It fosters trust. So many times Bobby was at my door, I've dropped another clanger.
Yep.
But I don't remember many of those, Bobby, to be fair. But there are opportunities to learn from that.
But
and
also
for me to learn from that. Yeah.
It also stops, as you say, it means that you can then go and tell your boss, I've dropped a clanger, because that then means that as a leader, you're able to do some emergency mopping up or, put the fire out before it turns into a massive, great big blaze. Whereas if everyone's afraid, people keep it a secret until it's too late, until the boss is, well, hang on a minute, I've noticed that something has gone wrong. I do think that that's the other side of it, that if you create these fearful circumstances or cultures, then you shouldn't be surprised that actually
become
small
big ones.
Mistakes have much bigger consequences. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it comes back to the same point around people having confidence and trust in you as a human being. And if you happen to be, that relationship is structured in a leadership context, that's incredibly helpful. But you can only foster that relationship if you are able to interact with an individual where they feel confident and that they can be who they are. So it comes right the way back to where we started. And I don't view any individual or any interaction with any other human being other than that's a human being that's working with me, and I don't have any consideration of gender, race, anything else.
Steve, what was the question I was going to ask? This is what keeps happening to my brain. Oh, yes, we were saying that all three of us are still learning. We hold ourselves up as everyday learners. Is there anything you can think of right now that you're really keen to learn, or does it just happen in a wave for you?
Yeah, I haven't got a sort of list of things that are on a development plan, Bobby, that I'm looking at every day. I think as the years go by, one learns to understand what you're good at and what you're less good at. And I guess that list continues to be refined, and I try to focus on the things that allegedly I'm slightly better at than the things I'm crap at. So I think that, and I think that comes back to some aspects of leadership, really. So if you put in the early days when I used to have to write board reports or review complex documents, it used to bore me to tears, and I was really poor at it. So I know now that don't get me to do things like that, because I'm going to be crap at it. So the answer to your question, Bobby, is that I continue to refine in my own mind the thing I'm slightly better at than I am crap at, and I try to focus on those things I'm slightly better at.
What about you, Bridge?
I'm just learning how to be a trainer, because I'm going to be doing some online courses. I'm currently just finished the learning bit where we had to learn about adult education, how people learn and deliver a presentation, and I'm now in the process of having to write an essay. So that's what I shall be doing when I go back to Cork on Saturday. I shall be writing an essay about adult learning and communication traits. So a lot of the stuff that we've been discussing between ourselves, really, in terms of when we talked about communication, how to get ideas across and how people listen, and the different types of people, how they absorb information, in a way is similar to what we were talking about, that we talk a lot, but there are lots of people who prefer to think and ponder much longer. So it's the actual learning in terms of the psychology, the training that I've been doing in the psychology of learning, it is helping me have some aha moments about some of the times where I've failed miserably to communicate properly with some of the people that I was working with. I know that communication and thinking about how other people, rather than thinking about how I understand things, is, I
think that's really, really powerful.
I need to learn.
Really powerful, Bridge. It's being able to truly listen as a manager or as a leader, being able to really understand what the other person is thinking and feeling and what's important to them is a fundamental touchstone, I think, in building an effective working relationship as a leader and understanding those differences.
How about you, Bobby?
I feel in a very grateful position of having the opportunity to coach, because I think when you're with coaching clients, the opportunity to actually learn from them. The coaching relationship is a two-way thing. It's not the tips and techniques and just the active listening piece for me as well. The 2 ears, 1 mouth is really good for me in sitting and actually creating the space for those sort of conversations to go on. So I learn all the time, and it is bringing me into contact with people who wouldn't normally be in my line of sight. That's really lovely. So I learn all the time from that. I'm incredibly interested in neuroscience. I never thought that the word science would come out of my mouth, being an English graduate, but I read and I webinar all the time about those elements, and it's almost like the conversation we were having yesterday, Bridge, about not being the people in the detail. But I think that sort of like supports, it evidences the work that I do intuitively as a coach, but I begin to start to understand some other element to it as well with actually studying neuroscience. And then the third thing for me is that I've just become a school governor, but I'm taking on as link governor for special educational needs, which seems to be on the rise. The schools that I'm working with have got a significant proportion of children, young children. And I think that if I can learn and in any way, shape or form support people with those needs, being able to live a full life, that's my bit about learning, but also giving back.
Nice. I think we are reaching the end of our lovely chat. Steve, it was so nice to meet you. I've heard so much about you. Bobby, you've obviously influenced her life significantly, and I would imagine that she's not the only person. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat to us and share the insight, which is really helpful. I'm sure will be helpful to all the many millions of people who are going to be listening to the podcast, albeit we've so far only identified probably 3, including Mum. Hi, Mum. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It's been a joy
Thanks,
to
Steve.
have some time with you both.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Since this episode was recorded, Steve has been swimming in support of BLESMA. He's the first amputee to complete the 9-mile swim across Lake Geneva. If you'd like to donate, the link to the BLESMA Just Giving page is in the episode notes on Spotify or the More Than a Lumpy Jumper website. Next week, we'll be chatting about stress and toxic work environments in being in community. See you then.